And now the shipping forecast issued by the Met Office at 05:05 on Thursday, the 5th of February 2004. There are warnings of gales in Forties, Dogger, Fisher, German Bight and Fair Isle. The area forecast for the next 24 hours.
Hey lads, what are you doing? Don't go in there! Tide's coming in!
Irish Sea.
A big rescue operation is underway in Morecambe Bay in Lancashire, where 22 cockle pickers have been caught by the incoming tide. They're up to their necks or waists in the freezing cold water. It's believed they're all Chinese.
I'm over Chinese boys in Morecambe Bay. And they're stolen. And they need pain or something, you're going to have to get them out today.
Three people drowned.
These were people with wives, with husbands, with children, that there were orphans now in China.
Illegal immigrants living and working in appalling conditions.
The reality, it's not what they were told. They could be paid anything, and they can't argue with the boss. They just have to take whatever they can lay their hands on.
Living in fear of the gangsters who had smuggled them into the UK.
You don't want to be talking about what these people do, because they run huge multi-million-pound criminal businesses, and life is worth nothing to them.
The deaths of 23 Chinese cockle pickers here on Morecambe Sands shocked Britain. Not only did it shine a light on the hidden world of human trafficking, it also exposed the appalling conditions suffered by those scratching a living to put food on our plates. The case would spark a government investigation into people smuggling rackets, but in the hours immediately after the tragedy, Lancashire police faced more urgent questions. Just who were the people who had drowned, and who had sent them to their deaths?
The victims were among legions of cocklers who had hit Morecambe's beaches in early 2004. The Irish Sea had provided a bumper harvest of shellfish, and buyers were queuing up in Britain and on the continent. Big demand meant the potential for big profits, but if seafood suppliers were to meet that demand, they needed cockle pickers who could work around the clock.
If you'd said to me before it all started that you could make money out of these little shellfish on the beach, I wouldn't have believed you. But when you see what draws that number of people to a beach, and you see people walking about with large wads of cash being doled out from buyers with even bigger piles of cash, it's quite an eye-opener.
Among the most willing workers were the Chinese. Gangs of up to 70 of them had first appeared on Morecambe's beaches a year earlier. They worked late into the night and in the harshest conditions. It was both backbreaking and dangerous. Many of the cockle beds were miles from the shoreline. To reach them, cocklers had to negotiate treacherous ground. Large expanses of quicksand could easily suck up a vehicle completely. Even tractors and transits have been known to become totally submerged. Then there were the water channels to deal with. To the untrained eye, the sands may appear flat, but the deep channels between the cockle beds and the shore can fill rapidly.
All estuaries are dangerous, but Morecambe Bay is, I would think, more dangerous than most, because it's such a vast expanse. The tide comes in as fast as a horse can gallop on the high tides, and changing the whole situation of the river. You cannot come out here and say, well, I know the way. People have been with me, you know, they come year after year, but they cannot say that, because every time you come out here, it's different.
On the night of the tragedy, the big cockling operators stayed at home. Unpredictable tides and freezing weather meant it would be risky to go out onto the sands for more than a few hours. But the harsh conditions didn't seem to deter one Chinese gang. Late that afternoon, a group of around 30 were spotted making their way out towards the sea.
They probably wouldn't know about the tide conditions with the bad weather. They might have had a tide table and been able to read it. But the tide should have been probably coming back at 9 o'clock, and it was probably coming back at about 7:30, and that's what the problem was. Anybody who was out on a night like that were desperation measures going out, I think.
Local fisherman Trevor Fleming was the last person to have contact with the cocklers. He spotted them at about 6 p.m. as he was packing up and heading back to shore. Experience told him they were heading for danger.
Hey lads, what are you doing? Don't go in there! Tide's coming in! Don't do it! Don't go cockling! Tide's coming in!
I tried to communicate one of the Chinese workers to explain that he was going to be pushing his luck and that the tide was coming in. He just put his rake on his shoulder, smiled at me, and walked off into the dark that night. I run through to the farm that I operate from and said, I think if any time that there's going to be an accident, I think it's possibly going to be tonight. They're still walking out there, and I don't think they're going to be able to walk back in time.
As the Chinese worked away into the night, they were unaware they were being surrounded by rising waters that would soon cut off their route back to shore.
It crept up behind them, and then it came up the other one, secondary. So they knew nothing that night. You can't hear out there the tide when there's a wind blowing. They knew nothing, working away, cockling, until the water was all around. They were circled, and there's just nowhere to run.
The channels fill up first. If the water's more than wading depth, you've got to swim for it. And there's no way you'd swim in them conditions. You'd probably have to try and swim 400 or 500 yards, 600 yards, in really bad conditions.
As the water began to rise, panic set in. The cocklers realised they were trapped. Unaware of how to contact the emergency services, some frantically phoned friends and family, both in England and in China, in an attempt to raise the alarm. Meanwhile, Coast Guards got their first inkling of trouble. An off-duty lifeboatman reported seeing a vehicle driving around erratically in the bay.
The first report only said 4 young people going out on a vehicle, so we thought it might just be 4 people. We didn't know if they'd actually stopped and turned round, but the lifeboatman said he couldn't see their lights anymore, the lights of the vehicle. So for the first call, it wasn't unfolding as a tragedy. It was 13 minutes past 9, and high water was 11 o'clock that night, so it was exactly the wrong time to be going out onto the bay. That was the first alert that something was wrong.
Within minutes, the Coast Guard received a second call, this time from an English woman. She said she knew a group of cockle pickers were trapped out in the bay.
I have got a load of Chinese boys in Morecambe Bay, and they're stuck.
And how many are out there, do you know?
There's a lot, and they need a plane or something. You're going to have to get them on today.
Right, they've been on the cockle bed, have they, in Morecambe Bay?
Yeah, cockle bed, Morecambe Bay. Can you please?
The Coast Guard launched an immediate search and rescue operation, calling in all branches of the emergency services. But even with 3 helicopters, heat-seeking cameras, a lifeboat and a hovercraft, the rescuers knew the chances of finding anyone alive were slim. Freezing waters meant that anyone who tried to swim to safety would be dead within minutes. Conditions were so bad that night that the rescuers were even risking their own lives during the search.
We had to pull the hovercraft back onto the beach. It couldn't operate. It was nearly capsized twice on the way to the scene. So we struggled with the hovercraft, and the boat, the lads on the boat said it was like being in a washing machine. It was very bad.
It can be very, very difficult searching for people in the water. At night time, you're looking for a dark head, because the head will be wet in the dark sea at night, and it's very, very difficult unless they have some aids to finding them. It's almost impossible.
Out in the bay, most of the cocklers were now in the water, still frantically trying to summon help. But the emergency services had no clue as to their exact position. At 9:30, they did manage to make contact with one of the trapped cocklers, but all they could make out was a drowning man's last desperate pleas for help.
Hello? Right, the police, where do you need the police, please? Sticky Walker, Sticky Walker!
Even though we couldn't understand what he was saying, we could tell by the tone of his voice he was very, very distressed.
Wait a minute, Sticky Walker! Sticky Walker, Sticky Walker!
And it was awful in the ops room at that time. You could tell the tragedy was unfolding by then.
Sticky Walker! Hello? Sticky Walker! Minute, Sticky Walker!
If you can put yourself in their position at that night when they're cut off, it's a pitch black night, pitch black sea all around you. Morecambe Bay is vast, but there are towns all the way around. So you'll see lights in almost every direction that you look, and then if you do turn the wrong way, you've got miles and miles of sea to cross and you will not make it.
At 10 p.m, the police helicopter spotted one cockler stranded on Priest Skier, an outcrop of rock a mile out from the shore.
We have visual with one person only at this stage.
An RNLI hovercraft raced to the scene, and 2 lifeboatmen later got the survivor safely on board. The Coast Guards had been told there were dozens of cocklers out that night. They didn't know exactly how many. As their search continued, their hopes faded.
I mean, obviously, when it gets to 3 and 4 hours that people have been missing in water at that time of year, you really are looking as a recovery mission rather than a rescue mission. And obviously, when after the first casualty was found dead, or obviously dead, that yeah, we're looking for more bodies really.
As the tide receded, 19 bodies were picked up from the bay.
They wouldn't have a chance at all. They'd stripped off and tried to swim for it. But it was a long swim in big waves, icy water. There would no chance at all. It's not very pleasant, is it? Knowing that they were all lads who had seen working. There was nothing wrong with them. They were working very close to where we were once or twice.
Lucky survivors who had managed to scramble to shore were found on or near the beach. They were wet, freezing and terrified. Traumatised, as were the rescue workers and many of the locals.
I never slept one wink that night or the next night, thinking about how those poor souls got drowned. So cold out there, the tide came in so fast around them, they'd be screaming and shouting, they wouldn't have known what to do, nowhere to go.
As dawn broke, the police arrived. A small-town tragedy would soon become a worldwide criminal investigation, leading detectives to China and to the heart of a people-smuggling operation here in Britain.
Now then, this time last night, as darkness fell, a group of Chinese workers...
The day after the horrific night before, 19 bodies had been recovered, 11 survivors were being treated, and 2 questions were paramount. What were the identities of the cockle pickers, and who had sent them out in such treacherous conditions? Within hours, detectives had declared it a manslaughter inquiry. They knew the case would present unique challenges.
Usually with most cases, You've got a street to go to, and you've got people to speak to who you know, and you usually know the name of the person who's dead, and there's lots of witnesses, and you've got a very good background of what's happened. In this case, we've got no idea who's dead, where